Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Mark Green, diabetes specialist dietitian. If you're watching on YouTube, then welcome, but make sure you also check out the blog diabetesdietguide.com, where I offer lots of free advice for people with diabetes to help you manage your condition. And if you need a further helping hand, then make sure you check out our programs, which are specifically designed to give you educational videos and diet plans to show you exactly what you need to do to help you manage your conditions. The time of filming, we have it for type 2 diabetes, and on its way is a weight loss program. But anyway, let's get into what we're talking about today. And the subject of the matter is ketones. Now, I previously blogged on whether or not you should be following a ketone diet, and I looked at the pros and cons, and anyone that doesn't give you the pros and cons of any diet, because there's always pros and cons, probably has a bias towards a particular diet and therefore maybe not take their word as gospel. So we're trying to stay balanced with our advice. So it's not about looking at the pros and cons. Today is telling you what ketones are, because actually a lot of people will go on these diets with no idea what's actually happening in their body. So that's what I'm going to take you through today. But before we can get on to ketones, we need to understand a little bit about metabolism and how energy is used in the body. Now we have three different macronutrients. Now macro means big. So macronutrients are the big nutrients in the body that give us energy. And we have four. We have carbohydrates, we have fat, we have protein, and we also have a fourth one, alcohol. Now we're not going to be talking about alcohol or protein for the matter today because they're not too relevant to today's lecture, although protein can form ketones, but I want to keep it nice and simple. So it's a bit more advanced chemistry in that sense. So we're just going to be focusing on carbohydrates and fats to keep things nice and simple, and it still gets the point across, so there's no need to get too in depth. So let's go. Now, the first thing is we need to look at carbohydrate metabolism. Now, the way to think about this is we have lots of different sources of carbohydrates. We have monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. So essentially how carbohydrates are presented to us when they enter our digestion is they are formed of lots of different chains. So they will have essentially glucose monomers, we call them. So glucose chains that link together. The more chains you have, the bigger the carbohydrate molecule. So a monosaccharide, for example, would be a unit of glucose, one, okay? Disaccharides are two joined together. So that's your examples of things like sucrose in sugar. So that's glucose and fructose joined together. Oligosaccharides, that's three joined together, okay? So that's the sort of carbohydrates that you find in like beans, pulses, lentils. And then polysaccharides are the really long chains of carbohydrates. So you'll know these more as starch. Now the body's really clever because it breaks down all of these into a single unit, glucose. So it all follows one single pathway. So it all funnels down into the same system. So whether it's mono, di, oligo, or poly, it all ends up as this one single glucose molecule, which the body then transports to the cells to be used as fuel. So transports, but at first it will hit the liver, because the liver is the engine room of the body. It's deciding where it's going to send energy for when it's needed. Now it can do two things. It can divert energy off when in times of need, or it can store it for later. So glucose can also take another form in the body in storage called glycogen. So glycogen. Now don't worry too much about glycogen today, because essentially glycogen sits in the liver and it will be released when the body needs it. Okay, so that is carbohydrate metabolism. Now assuming we have a good source of carbohydrate in the diet, this process will be continuing. Now looking at fat metabolism. So fat, again, is a kind of a mini umbrella term because there's lots of different types of fat, but at the basic, simplistic, energy-giving example, we have two. We have fatty acids, which will be follow their own pathway to provide energy, and we also have ketones. And this is what we're talking about today. We have two types of ketones. We have acetoacetate, and we have BETAHYDROXYBUTYRATE. Two different types of ketones, okay? So these can also give us energy. Fatty acids follow their own pathway to provide different types of energy, okay? These two will also feed into the liver, which will then be distributed out to the body to provide energy. So as I mentioned, it is the liver that's kind of the engine room or the driving force behind this. So this will be deciding where the energy is going. Now we know we have fatty acids that provide energy, ketones and glucose. So all of these are not in their finished state. They are broken down further into smaller molecules so then they can actually be broken down further again to get into the substances that we need to actually provide energy. Now, these are all broken down into one single molecule called acetyl coenzyme. And it's this molecule that enters the cells of the muscle, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, wherever energy is needed. And then from there, it enters the energy factory, which has a lot of different chemical reactions, which ultimately yields energy. Each molecule will produce a different amount of energy, depending on the chemical reaction. So we can see it's quite a complex system at play. And when you look at chemistry or biochemistry textbooks, it really gets deep and you need to be quite tuned in to understand the process, but we can keep it nice and simple. Now, ketones are a part of normal metabolism, so they will always be there, but they can be in greater amounts or smaller amounts, depending on what this glucose metabolism is doing, because we need to provide the same amount of this acetyl coenzyme regardless. The body has an energy requirement, and if we're not meeting the energy requirement, things are going to go south quite quick. So let's say we started to reduce the amount of glucose that is produced. Suddenly, we need to increase the amount of fatty acids and ketones that are produced to take up the slack. This doesn't necessarily mean that you are getting slimmer because you're burning more fat, because if you're still taking in the same amount of calories, then it's neither here nor there because you're still getting the same amount of energy, okay? So to lose weight, you need to be in a negative energy balance. You need less calories coming in than actually you're expending and giving out. But because glucose is the primary fuel for the brain and the central nervous system, if we are surplus of glucose, we really need to increase this ketone metabolism to take up the slack, because fatty acids can't do it. So you'll find an increase in ketones, and after the liver has dumped all its glycogen to try and compensate for the lack of glucose, we're suddenly working off fumes here, and so the ketones will start to increase. Now, there's a few things that are going to influence whether or not we're getting enough glucose into the system. The first thing is, are we eating enough glucose? So if you have a zero carbohydrate diet or a very low carbohydrate diet categorized as less than 50 grams per day generally, you'll probably find that actually your ketone production starts to increase. However, it will still be within normal levels, but it will definitely be higher than what you'd see with someone who was having carbohydrates in the diet. The other thing that will influence this is hormones. So during periods between eating and overnight, your body upregulates a hormone called glucagon and downregulates a hormone called insulin. So when glucagon is high, we're actually starting to pump out glycogen from the liver and turn it into glucose. We're starting to use up energy. We're pumping out more fatty acids and we're pumping out more ketones. But because we still have glucose coming from the liver, it's all relative. So the ketones will not be in a tremendous amount. And on the other hand, when insulin is higher, what we're finding is we're going from a state of where we're using up these energy substrates, and instead we're storing them. So glucose turns into glycogen, and fat is stored as triglycerides. So it goes into storage for later. Now, the problems start to emerge particularly in type 1 diabetes when people aren't producing their own insulin. So if they were to miss their background insulin, their long-lasting insulin, then suddenly they've got no off switch in terms of storing. So the liver starts dumping all the glycogen out because there's been no signal to store the glucose, and instead we start pushing it out. So at first, the ketones won't start to rise and the fatty acids, they will still be released, but the glucose is doing its job. But quite quickly, the glucose levels go very high because insulin also takes glucose from outside in the blood into the cells of the body where it can be used for energy. So this basically can only enter the cells if there's insulin present. But because insulin isn't getting, because there's no insulin, the glucose can't get to where it's supposed to go. So the body thinks, uh-oh, no carbohydrate, no glucose, so instead I better start kicking out a whole bunch of fatty acid and a whole bunch of ketones. Now this is where it becomes problematic in diabetes and type 1 particularly, because that's when you start to see a marked increase in the ketone production. And ketones lower the body's pH. They basically make you become acidic. So usually with a normal amount of insulin, as someone who's just following a low carbohydrate diet, that's not going to be a problem. But when there's no insulin present, these ketones are going to raise tremendous amounts to the point of dangerous levels, and people can enter a state called diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetes, high glucose levels, high ketone levels, and acidic, which is not a good scenario to be in. And in fact, if left untreated, people will very quickly, unfortunately, pass away. So it's something serious. So in type 1 diabetes, we're particularly keen for people not to follow ketone diets, because should they become unwell or miss an insulin dose, or for whatever reason their glucose levels get high, they're already playing with fire. Their ketones are already elevated. Now, the reason we get a bit twitchy with ketone diets without diabetes or in type 2 diabetes is just because, one, you are making the body a bit more acidic. It's not such a big issue, but in reality, it's what's missing in the diet elsewhere. Fruit and vegetables, for example, whole grains. So when you look at the evidence, yes, ketone diets may initiate a slightly greater weight loss effect at the beginning. Maybe the difference between 5 and 4 kilograms in the first 6 months. Clinically significant, but not a tremendous amount, 1 kilo difference on average. But when you also look at the evidence, there is a tremendous amount of studies that show us that fruit, vegetables, whole grains are good for us. They reduce cancer risk, cardiovascular disease, diabetes risk. There are many, many benefits. So it's not necessarily about going onto a ketone diet, although there are pros, and watch the other blog on that, but it's about what you might be missing in the diet elsewhere, so we're not getting a nutritionally complete diet. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that because I've already blogged about that before, but hopefully now you understand a bit more about what ketones are, how this system works, and actually what you might be putting your body through should you decide to go on a ketone diet. Any questions that you have, please post them below. Always happy to answer them as I see them. And I'll leave it there for now, guys. Remember to check out the blog, diabetesdietguy.com. Remember to check out the programs if you need a helping hand, and I'll see you later.